He once shouted, "I don't owe you or your child anything." 2 years later, he found 3 little girls with his eyes, and realized he'd been wrong about everything. The rain fell in steady sheets against the tall windows of James Holt's penthouse, the sound mingling with the quiet hum of the city far below. Inside, the air was tense, thick with words that had already been spoken but could not be taken back. Lana stood near the door, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself, her eyes glistening but defiant. James stood across the room, tall, sharp-featured, his expression set in stone. His pale hair caught the dim light, making him look every bit the man people feared and admired, a self-made millionaire, powerful, disciplined, and ruthless. But in that moment, there was something else in his eyes too, something brittle, something almost human, though buried under anger and fear. "You can't just walk away from this," Lana said quietly, her voice shaking but steady enough to be heard over the storm outside. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just thought you should know." Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, a small gesture that made his jaw tighten. James turned away, pacing toward the window. His reflection stared back at him, unreadable. "You shouldn't have come here," he said finally, his tone clipped and cold. "You knew what this was from the beginning. You knew I wasn't the kind of man who could give you what you wanted." Lana's lips parted, but no sound came out. She wanted to tell him that she hadn't wanted anything from him, that what they had shared had been real, even if only for a short time. Instead, she took a breath and said, "This isn't about what I want, James. This is about what's right." He turned sharply, his blue eyes hard as glass. "Right?" he repeated, almost laughing. "You think it's right to throw this at me now? To ruin everything I've worked for? You know what my life is, Lana. I can't have this. Not now. Not ever." She took a step forward, tears breaking through her restraint. "It's not about your career or your reputation. This is a life, James. Our life." The silence that followed was suffocating. He stared at her for a long moment, then said the words that would haunt him for years. "I don't owe you or your child anything." The room went still. The sound of the rain seemed to stop, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Lana looked at him, the color draining from her face. She didn't scream or argue. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and whispered, "You'll regret this someday." Then she turned, opened the door, and left. He didn't follow. He stood there, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade down the hallway, and tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. He told himself that love was a distraction, that weakness had no place in the life he had built. He told himself that cutting her out was necessary. Yet even as he repeated those lies, a small, unfamiliar ache began to spread in his chest. That night, he poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker below. He thought of her laugh, the way she used to look at him as if she could see past the layers of steel and ambition he had wrapped around himself. He told himself it didn't matter. That it was over. That she would move on. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was her face and the quiet devastation in her eyes when he said those words. The image followed him into his dreams, where it twisted into something crueler, something that made him wake in the middle of the night, gasping for air. He told himself he'd forget. He didn't. Weeks passed, then months. He buried himself in work, taking on new projects, flying across countries, signing contracts worth millions. Outwardly, he was thriving. But inside, something in him had gone numb. The laughter at his success dinners sounded distant, meaningless. His penthouse, once a symbol of achievement, now felt like an empty box echoing with silence. Sometimes, late at night, he would imagine what might have been if he had said something different, if he had stopped her that night and told her to stay. He'd picture her smile, her voice, the way her hands would have touched his face gently when he let his guard down. Then he would remind himself that such thoughts were useless. One morning, months later, his secretary walked into his office holding a stack of papers and mentioned casually that she had seen Lana's name in a local charity listing. He didn't ask for details, but something inside him twisted painfully. He wanted to ask, but he couldn't. Instead, he nodded curtly and went back to his meeting, but his hands shook when he signed the next contract. That night, he drank more than usual. The next morning, he couldn't remember how he'd gotten home. Meanwhile, miles away, Lana stood in a small apartment surrounded by 3 cribs, humming softly to the tiny newborn girls sleeping side by side. She looked tired but peaceful, her heart full of something stronger than bitterness, resolve. Each baby was perfect, each one a reminder of what she had lost and what she had gained. As she watched their chests rise and fall, she whispered, "You'll never feel unwanted. Not while I'm here." The storm outside had passed, leaving the world washed clean, and though her tears still came quietly, she finally allowed herself to smile. Back in the city, James couldn't sleep. The silence of his home pressed against him like a weight. Every success felt hollow, every deal meaningless. He had told himself he owed nothing to her or to the child she carried, but the truth clawed at him in the dark. Somewhere out there was something that should have been his, a piece of himself he had thrown away. He didn't know it yet, but that one night, those cruel words, would follow him for years, until he was finally forced to face what he had done and the love he had turned away. 2 years earlier, when Lana had left the city, she had carried nothing but a suitcase, a few baby clothes, and the strength she didn't know she possessed. The world outside James's apartment had been merciless: cold streets, endless job rejections, and nights filled with fear and exhaustion, but she survived, not for herself, but for the 3 small lives that depended on her. When the twins were born, the nurses gasped at how identical they were: 3 tiny girls with soft blonde hair, pale lashes, and blue eyes so bright they seemed to hold the sky inside them. Claire, Emma, and Lily. The names had come to her instinctively, as though whispered by something greater than her own broken heart. She raised them alone in a small coastal town far from the city, where nobody knew her name or her story. The sea became her comfort, the sound of waves filled the nights when the loneliness became unbearable. The first months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless crying. Lana worked from home, creating handmade jewelry that she sold online. Every coin she earned went toward formula, diapers, and rent. There were moments when she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all, but then one of the girls would giggle in her sleep, or wrap her tiny fingers around Lana's thumb, and the exhaustion would turn into something softer, a reminder that this love was worth every scar. She often sat by the window after midnight, watching the moonlight spill across their cribs, whispering to them stories about kindness, bravery, and the kind of strength she hoped they would one day understand. She never spoke his name, but sometimes, when she looked at their blue eyes, his blue eyes, she felt a sharp ache of memory. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something deeper, a quiet sorrow she learned to carry without letting it consume her. In that time, James was living a different kind of loneliness. His life was polished and perfect on the surface. He had become the youngest CEO in his company's history, featured in magazines and invited to galas where people called him brilliant and fearless. Yet when the nights came, when the noise of the world faded and he was left with silence, regret began to seep through the cracks of his composure. He told himself he had done what was necessary, that he had avoided a scandal, protected his image, kept his empire intact. But sometimes, in the reflection of his glass of whiskey, he saw her face, the way her eyes had darkened when he shouted those cruel words, the way her voice trembled when she said he'd regret it. He tried to push it away, drowning himself in meetings, charity dinners, and empty relationships that ended before they began. Every woman he met reminded him of what he had destroyed, and every morning, he woke feeling older, emptier, and further from the man he thought he was. Meanwhile, Lana's daughters were growing fast. By the time they turned 2, their laughter filled the small apartment with life. They ran through the rooms barefoot, their little hands sticky with fruit and paint, their voices blending into a melody that made every sacrifice worth it. People in town adored them, 3 golden-haired girls who always smiled. Sometimes the neighbors would help by bringing groceries or offering to watch them while Lana worked. For the first time since she left, she began to believe that maybe she could build a life that didn't revolve around what she had lost. Yet late at night, when the world grew quiet and the girls slept beside her, she would catch herself wondering if James ever thought about them. Did he ever imagine what they looked like? Did he ever wake up and feel the emptiness she had lived with for so long? The thought of him still hurt, but now the pain came with acceptance. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. There were days when she caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The girl who once believed in fairy tales and grand gestures had turned into a woman who measured love by quiet endurance. Her hands bore small scars from the tools she used to craft her jewelry, her eyes carried traces of fatigue, yet there was a beauty in her resilience. People in the market often admired her strength without knowing her story. When men tried to flirt, she smiled politely and walked away. Her heart was no longer open to anything that might break it again. Her entire world revolved around the 3 little girls who called her mommy and trusted her completely. James, on the other hand, had started to lose control of the perfect life he had built. His company was still powerful, but his passion for it had begun to fade. His board of directors noticed the change, his detachment, his coldness even for business. He showed up to meetings late, sometimes distracted, his mind elsewhere. He had begun to drink more, not in celebration as before, but in silence. His friends noticed but said nothing. His assistant, a quiet woman who had worked with him for years, once caught him staring out the window for nearly an hour, lost in thought. When she finally asked what he was thinking about, he said only, "Nothing that matters anymore." She didn't press him further, but she knew something in him had broken long ago and had never healed. One evening, after another meaningless business dinner, James returned home to his empty apartment. He removed his tie, poured a drink, and sat on the edge of his bed. The city lights glowed faintly through the glass wall behind him. He opened the drawer of his nightstand and took out a small photo, one he had kept hidden for years. It was a picture of Lana, taken during one of their rare weekends away. She was laughing, sunlight caught in her hair, her eyes bright and alive. He stared at it for a long time before whispering, "I didn't mean it." The words were quiet, almost a confession to the silence. He had told himself for 2 years that he didn't care, that she and the child didn't matter, but now the truth was suffocating him. He cared more than he could bear. In that same moment, across the miles, Lana sat on her couch, holding a small pair of shoes one of the girls had outgrown. She smiled softly, tracing her fingers over the tiny soles, and whispered, "You're getting too big, my loves." She placed the shoes in a box she kept in the corner, small keepsakes from each stage of their young lives. Every piece of that box was a record of her love, her survival, and the quiet, unwavering promise she had made to never let them feel abandoned. She didn't know that somewhere far away, the man who had once rejected her was sitting alone, drowning in the echo of his own words. Neither of them could see that fate was already drawing their paths toward each other again, setting the stage for the moment when the past they tried to forget would finally demand to be faced. The morning began like any other for James, but beneath the surface of routine there was a quiet unrest that he could no longer ignore. He had spent another night tossing in bed, haunted by dreams that blurred the past and present. In them, he always saw Lana, sometimes angry, sometimes crying, sometimes walking away while he stood frozen, unable to call her back. When he woke, the ache lingered like a dull pressure in his chest. He tried to shake it off with the same mechanical precision that had once defined him. Coffee, shower, news, office. Yet even the office, once his kingdom, no longer gave him the same sense of purpose. The walls of glass and marble felt like a cage now. The people who greeted him each morning with forced smiles were part of a script he no longer believed in. During meetings, he caught himself staring out the window, wondering what her life might look like now. Was she still angry? Had she moved on? Did she ever think of him when the nights were quiet and the children slept? That thought always brought a pang sharp enough to make him reach for his phone, though he never dialed. What would he even say? How could he face the woman whose trust he had shattered so completely? He told himself that reaching out now would only reopen wounds, that she didn't need him, that she was better off. Yet the voice of reason no longer carried weight against the growing emptiness inside him. He started noticing small things, a stroller in the park, the sound of a child's laughter, a woman with long brown hair passing by, that triggered something raw, something painfully familiar. One afternoon, while leaving a restaurant, he saw a young mother crossing the street, holding a toddler with blonde curls and blue eyes. The sight hit him like a physical blow. His breath caught, his pulse quickened, and for one wild moment he thought it was her. It wasn't. But the resemblance was enough to leave him shaken. That night, for the first time in years, he opened his laptop and searched her name. Nothing. She had vanished completely, no trace left online, no address, no photos. It was as if she had erased herself from the world. Meanwhile, in that small coastal town, Lana's life had settled into a rhythm of quiet stability. The girls were growing fast, each with her own small spark of individuality despite their identical looks. Claire was bold and talkative, Emma thoughtful and gentle, Lily endlessly curious. They filled her days with noise, questions, and laughter. Every morning they climbed into her bed, their hair tangled, their giggles infectious, and demanded breakfast before she had even opened her eyes. Life was still hard, but it was full. She had started teaching art classes for children at the local community center, and though the pay was modest, the work brought her joy. Her jewelry business had grown too. She sold pieces online to clients from across the country, often working late into the night when the house was quiet. There were moments when exhaustion consumed her, yet when she looked at her daughters sleeping side by side, their hands sometimes linked even in dreams, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were her purpose, her redemption. Still, there were nights when the past came back, uninvited. Sometimes, when the girls were in bed and the wind outside howled against the windows, she would sit alone with a cup of tea and allow herself to remember. The warmth of his hands, the low timbre of his voice, the way he used to look at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Those memories no longer burned with anger, they carried a kind of quiet sadness instead. She wondered what had become of him, if he had ever thought of the child he had denied, if he had changed. But she didn't dwell on it long. She couldn't afford to. The past was behind her, and her daughters were the only future she needed. For James, however, the past refused to stay buried. The company was preparing for an expansion project near the coast, and when his assistant handed him the file, something about the name of the town caught his attention. It tugged at the edge of his memory, though he couldn't place why. He set the folder aside, but hours later, curiosity got the better of him. He typed the name into a search engine, looking through photos of the town, small streets lined with trees, a quiet harbor, markets full of local crafts. It looked peaceful, the kind of place where people went to escape the world. For reasons he didn't understand, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Within a week, he had scheduled a trip to personally review the new project site. His colleagues assumed it was business, he didn't correct them. But deep down, something told him this was about more than contracts and construction. When he arrived, the air smelled of salt and rain. The town was smaller than he expected, charming and unassuming. He spent the first day in meetings, nodding through presentations he barely heard. His mind kept drifting to the streets outside, the faces of strangers passing by the windows. That evening, restless and unable to sleep, he went for a walk through the narrow lanes near the waterfront. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of violet. He stopped by a cafe for coffee, and that was when he saw them, a woman with long brown hair tied loosely at the back, wearing a simple blue dress, and 3 little girls sitting beside her, identical down to the smallest detail. They were laughing over spilled ice cream, their blue eyes bright with joy. The sound froze him in place. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it, that his mind had finally turned his guilt into visions. But when the woman looked up, when her eyes met his, he knew. It was her. Time collapsed. The noise of the world disappeared. Lana. And those 3 little girls, their hair, their eyes, even their small gestures, they were him. He knew it with a certainty that hit harder than anything he had ever felt in his life. His heart pounded as she gathered napkins, laughing softly, unaware of his stare. Every muscle in his body screamed to go to her, to say something, anything, but his feet refused to move. He watched from a distance as she helped the girls down from their seats and walked toward the park across the street. The smallest one stumbled, and Lana bent down, steadying her with gentle hands. It was such a simple, beautiful motion, yet it broke him completely. He stood there long after they were gone, his coffee growing cold in his hand, his pulse still racing. That night, back in his hotel, he didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window, the sound of the waves in the distance echoing the storm inside him. For 2 years he had told himself he didn't owe her anything, didn't owe the child anything, but now he knew how wrong he had been. He hadn't just walked away from her. He had walked away from his entire life. James didn't remember driving back to the hotel that night. The world outside his windshield was a blur of rain and headlights, yet all he could see were 3 small faces and the woman he had once sworn he would never need. He spent the night pacing the room, his thoughts tangled in disbelief and guilt. Every sound of the ocean outside seemed to mock him, whispering reminders of what he had lost. The girls had been so alive, full of laughter, so real that he could no longer convince himself that time or distance had erased his responsibility. He replayed the moment over and over, their matching blue eyes, their blonde hair, the way Lana's voice sounded when she called their names. Each repetition cut deeper. When dawn broke, he was still awake, his reflection in the mirror a stranger's face, tired, pale, hollow. He had built empires, outmaneuvered rivals, and stood at the top of the world, yet one glimpse of those children had undone him completely. He could no longer hide behind success. The truth he had buried had clawed its way back to the surface, demanding to be faced. The next day, he drove to the cafe again, hoping to see them, unsure what he would say if he did. The town was small, and part of him feared that she might have recognized him and decided to disappear again. He waited in his car for hours, eyes scanning every passerby, nerves pulled tight with anticipation. The minutes stretched into hours, and just as he was about to give up, he saw her. Lana was walking down the street holding 2 of the girls' hands while the third skipped ahead, her small voice carrying through the afternoon air. James felt his chest tighten. They stopped by a fruit stand, and he watched as Lana crouched to help one of the girls choose apples. The sight was so ordinary, so intimate, that it felt almost sacred. He got out of the car before he could second-guess himself, his pulse hammering in his ears. When he called her name, it came out softer than he expected, almost a whisper. She froze mid-motion, her back still turned, and for a moment he thought she might pretend not to hear. Then she turned. The air between them seemed to vanish. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. The girls, sensing something unfamiliar, grew quiet and clung to her skirt. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but steady. He took a hesitant step forward, struggling to find words that didn't sound meaningless. "I came for business," he said, his throat dry, but when I saw you," he stopped. There was no way to finish that sentence that wouldn't sound hollow. Lana shook her head slowly, disbelief written across her face. "You saw me," she repeated quietly, her tone carrying both confusion and pain. "After everything, after those words, you have the nerve to say that like it means something?" Her words cut deeper than any insult ever could. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking when he finally spoke again. "I didn't know, Lana. I didn't know there were 3 of them." She interrupted him before he could continue, her expression hardening. "You didn't want to know," she said. "That's the difference." He had no defense. Every excuse died on his tongue because she was right. He had been too proud, too afraid to let anyone see weakness. And now the cost of that pride stood before him in the shape of 3 little girls he had never met. He tried to speak again, but the words came out uneven. "They're beautiful," he said, his eyes flicking toward the children, who were now watching him with innocent curiosity. "They look like you." Lana gave a bitter laugh. "No," she said. "They look like you. Every day I wake up and see your face 3 times over, and every day I remind myself that I did it without you." James felt his stomach twist. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of waves crashing in the distance. He took a slow step closer. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," he said quietly. "I just want a chance to know them. Please." Lana's eyes flashed with anger, but behind it was something else, fear. "You think you can just walk back in after 2 years?" she said. "Do you know what it was like? Raising them alone, working through the nights, worrying if I could feed them, if I could keep them warm? You don't get to ask for anything." He didn't argue. He couldn't. The image of her fighting through all that alone made his throat burn. "You're right," he said finally. "I don't deserve a second chance. But I'm not leaving until I make this right." For a long time, she said nothing. She turned to her daughters, who were tugging gently at her hand, confused by the tension in her voice. When she finally looked back at him, her eyes were full of exhaustion. "You don't even know what right means anymore," she said softly. "Go back to your world, James. We survived without you. We don't need saving now." She started to walk away, her shoulders squared, her daughters surrounding her like tiny reflections of the woman she had become, strong, resilient, unbroken. He stood there, unable to move, watching until they disappeared down the street. The emptiness that followed felt heavier than ever before. That night, he sat alone in his car near her house, watching the lights in the window flicker as the girls played inside. He could hear faint laughter, muffled through the glass, and it struck him how foreign that sound was to his world. He stayed there for hours, not because he wanted to intrude, but because he couldn't leave. He needed to see it, to remind himself that this wasn't a dream, that what he had lost was real and alive. When the lights finally dimmed and the house fell silent, he rested his head against the steering wheel, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. The next few days passed in a haze. He found excuses to linger in town, meetings rescheduled, phone calls delayed. He told himself he just wanted to make sure they were all right, but the truth was simpler: he couldn't stay away. Each evening he would park nearby and watch from a distance, trying to piece together fragments of their life. Sometimes he saw Lana walking with the girls to the playground, their small hands holding hers tightly. Other times, he caught sight of her closing the shop where she sold her crafts, her hair glinting in the sunset. Every glimpse deepened his remorse. The more he saw, the clearer it became that she had built a life without him, one grounded in love and resilience, and that realization hurt in a way success never could mend. One afternoon, he returned to the same cafe where he had first seen them. Lana was there again, sitting outside with a sketchbook while the girls colored beside her. He hesitated, knowing he was risking her anger, but something inside told him it was time to face her honestly. He approached slowly, his voice low when he spoke. "I know you don't want me here," he said, "but I'm not here to take anything from you. I just need to understand what I threw away." She looked up, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she sighed and said quietly, "You can sit, but I don't promise I'll stay." He sat across from her, his hands clasped together, unsure where to begin. Watching her draw, surrounded by the children, he felt both awe and shame. She had become something far stronger than the woman he had left behind. She didn't need him anymore, and that truth was both humbling and devastating. When one of the girls accidentally spilled juice across the table, James instinctively reached for a napkin, helping to clean it. The child smiled at him shyly, and for the first time, he allowed himself to smile back. Lana noticed but said nothing. She simply watched, her eyes softening just a little. That small, fragile moment would stay with him for the rest of his life, the beginning of something uncertain but real. As the evening sun dipped lower, he realized he wasn't fighting for redemption anymore. He was fighting for the chance to belong, even if it meant starting from the very bottom. The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and quiet discovery. James found himself waking up earlier each morning, his mind already restless, thinking of the small coastal town and the lives unfolding there without him. He still didn't know what he was hoping for: redemption, forgiveness, or simply the chance to see his daughters again, but he knew one thing with certainty: leaving was no longer an option. He had walked away once, and it had destroyed more than just a relationship, it had stripped him of his humanity. He wasn't going to repeat that mistake. Each evening, he drove to the cafe or the park, and though he never imposed himself on Lana, he remained near, quietly waiting for the chance to prove he could be more than the man who once abandoned her. Sometimes she ignored him completely, her walls high and unyielding, but other times she allowed him to sit nearby, pretending not to notice when the girls smiled and waved at him. Those small gestures, innocent and spontaneous, were the only warmth he had felt in years. Gradually, something began to shift. One afternoon, Lana needed help carrying groceries to her car, and before she could protest, James stepped forward to assist her. The simple act broke an invisible barrier. He followed her home, helping unload the bags while the girls ran circles around them, giggling. The house was small but filled with light, the walls adorned with drawings and little crafts the girls had made. It smelled like lavender and cookies, a soft domestic chaos that felt worlds away from the sterile perfection of his penthouse. When Lana noticed him looking around, she crossed her arms and said quietly, "Don't get too comfortable. This is their world, not yours." Her tone wasn't cruel, just defensive, and he nodded, accepting the boundary. Still, as he watched her laugh when one of the girls dropped a toy and another tried to help, he couldn't help but feel that this simple, messy, beautiful life, was everything he had ever wanted without knowing it. Over the next weeks, he became a quiet presence in their lives. He started small, bringing the girls coloring books, helping fix the broken steps on the porch, or repairing the leaky faucet in the kitchen. Lana resisted at first, suspicious of his intentions, but it was impossible to ignore how naturally the girls responded to him. They began calling him Mr. J, their mispronounced version of his name, and he didn't correct them. The first time he heard it, something inside him cracked open. He spent evenings telling them stories about faraway places and teaching them how to skip stones on the beach. When they laughed, it filled the emptiness he had carried for years, softening edges he didn't realize had grown so sharp. He never spoke to them about the past or his connection to them. He wanted them to see him for who he was now, not the man he used to be. Lana watched all of this from a distance, torn between fear and reluctant admiration. Every instinct told her to protect her daughters, to shield them from another heartbreak, yet she couldn't deny that James was different. There was no arrogance in him anymore, no trace of the man who once valued power over people. He showed up without expectation, worked without complaint, and listened without defending himself. When she was exhausted, he would quietly take over dinner or read to the girls so she could rest. One evening, as she stood by the doorway watching him kneel on the floor with 3 identical girls clinging to his arms, she felt an unfamiliar ache in her chest, something between grief and hope. She turned away before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. For James, every day with them was a lesson in humility. He had spent years surrounded by people who obeyed him, who feared disappointing him, yet here, in this small house, 3 little girls told him exactly what they thought. They corrected his storytelling, laughed when he burned pancakes, and scolded him when he forgot to wash his hands before dinner. He found himself laughing too, real laughter that reached his eyes. He hadn't realized how empty his world had been until now. Sometimes, late at night, when he returned to his hotel, he would sit in silence, replaying the day in his mind, the sound of their voices echoing like music. He wanted to tell Lana the truth, to claim his daughters, but something held him back. He knew that truth, if spoken too soon, might shatter the fragile peace that had begun to grow between them. One rainy afternoon, he arrived at the house to find Lana sitting on the porch, her face pale and tired. One of the girls, Emma, had fallen sick with a fever. Panic flickered in her eyes, the same kind of helplessness he remembered from the night she had told him she was pregnant. Without a word, he stepped inside, moving with quiet purpose. He fetched cold towels, helped measure medicine, and stayed by the child's bedside until she finally fell asleep. When he looked up, Lana was watching him, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to stay," she whispered. "I know," he replied softly, "but I want to." Those words, simple and sincere, hung between them like a fragile truce. She didn't answer, but she didn't ask him to leave either. Hours passed, and the house grew dark and quiet. The rain tapped softly against the windows as James sat beside Emma's bed, one hand resting near hers, just in case she woke. When Lana finally spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "You think this changes anything?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No. It doesn't change the past. But maybe it can change what comes next." She looked at him for a long time before sighing. "You always had the right words," she said. "The problem was, you never had the right heart." Her honesty struck him harder than anger ever could, but he didn't defend himself. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "But I'm trying to fix that." When morning came, the fever had broken. Lana found him asleep in the chair beside the bed, his head tilted, exhaustion etched across his face. For a moment, she simply watched him, noticing how the years had softened his features. He looked older, but there was a gentleness there now, a peace she had never seen before. Something inside her began to shift, not in a sudden burst but slowly, like the tide wearing away the edge of a stone. Later that day, as the girls played outside, she brought him a cup of coffee. He took it with a quiet thank you, their fingers brushing for the first time in years. Neither of them spoke about what had happened, but both felt it, the first fragile thread of trust being woven between them again. In the following days, James became part of their rhythm. He learned how to braid hair, though his clumsy attempts made the girls laugh until they cried. He repaired the old swing in the yard and taught them how to plant flowers in the garden. Every moment with them healed something he hadn't realized was broken. Lana still kept her distance emotionally, but she no longer flinched when he was near. At night, when he drove back to the hotel, he thought of her sitting by the window, the glow of lamplight on her hair, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet, stubborn hope. He knew the road ahead would be long, that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, but he also knew he wasn't leaving. For the first time in his life, he was where he belonged, and he was ready to fight for it, no matter how long it took. The days began to blur into a rhythm that felt almost natural, though neither James nor Lana quite knew what to call it. He came by most mornings now, always with some small reason to be there, a bag of groceries, a repair that needed finishing, or simply to walk the girls to the park before work. Each time, Lana told herself she would set boundaries, that she wouldn't let him blend into their lives so easily, yet every time he appeared at the door, the words caught in her throat. The girls adored him without question. They ran to him the moment they saw his car, shouting his name and tugging at his hands, eager to tell him about their day. He had become part of their small world so quietly that even she had to admit it was no longer possible to imagine their days without him. What unsettled her most was not his presence, but the way it no longer hurt to see him. The bitterness that had once defined her feelings toward him had slowly been replaced by something softer, something dangerous. She could no longer deny that the man who stood in her kitchen making breakfast for their daughters was not the same man who had once thrown her out of his life. For James, the change felt like redemption, though he never dared to call it that. Every moment spent with them was a chance to rewrite the story he had destroyed 2 years before. He didn't speak about the past because he knew no apology could erase it, but he let his actions speak for him. He fixed broken things without being asked, stayed up late helping with the girls' art projects, and always made sure Lana had time to rest. Sometimes, when the girls were asleep, he lingered just long enough to see her exhale, her shoulders finally relaxing after a long day. In those quiet moments, when the world outside was still, he found himself wondering if there might one day be room for forgiveness. Yet he was careful not to push. She had built a life without him, and if all he could do was stand beside her now and share its weight, that was enough. The first real crack in her resistance appeared one afternoon when a storm rolled in unexpectedly. The girls were frightened by the thunder, clinging to her legs as the lights flickered. Without thinking, she called James. He arrived within minutes, drenched from the rain, and scooped up the crying children as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He comforted them with a calm she hadn't expected, whispering stories and holding them close until the storm quieted. When the power went out completely, the 5 of them sat together by candlelight, the faint orange glow flickering across their faces. The girls fell asleep one by one, curled up in blankets, while Lana and James sat across from each other in silence. The sound of rain tapping on the windows filled the room, soft and steady. For the first time since that night years ago, she looked at him without seeing the man who had broken her. She saw instead the man who had come back and stayed. When the lights returned hours later, she noticed that his shirt was still damp, that his hands were trembling slightly from the cold. Without a word, she stood, disappeared into the bedroom, and returned with a dry sweater. "You'll get sick," she said, handing it to him. He took it, their fingers brushing briefly, and for a moment, they both froze. There was a weight in that small contact, an unspoken recognition of everything they had once shared and everything they had lost. He looked at her with eyes that were softer now, humble, and full of quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. It wasn't just for the sweater, and she knew it. She nodded, turning away before he could see the emotion rising in her eyes. That night marked a turning point neither of them spoke about but both felt deeply. The air between them changed, still fragile, still uncertain, but no longer poisoned by anger. Days passed, and the tension that had once filled every glance began to ease. James started staying longer, helping with dinner, playing with the girls until bedtime. Sometimes, when they sat together at the table after the children had gone to sleep, conversation would drift from light jokes to quieter things, memories, regrets, dreams they had once had and abandoned. He told her about his business troubles, how he had lost his focus, how everything he once thought mattered had turned to dust. She listened, not out of pity but because she wanted to understand. For the first time, he wasn't talking to impress her, he was talking because he needed her to see him for who he was now, stripped of pride. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of blue and gold, Lana caught him sitting on the porch, watching the girls chase fireflies. She joined him, sitting quietly beside him without speaking. The air smelled of salt and summer grass, the sound of the sea humming softly in the distance. "They love you," she said finally, her tone calm, almost contemplative. "You've made it hard for them to imagine life without you." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. The question hung heavy in the air. She looked at him, searching his face, and saw the sincerity there, the man waiting for her to decide his fate. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "You hurt me in ways I can't forget. But when I see them laugh with you, when I see you with them, I don't know what to do with that." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the horizon, his jaw tightening as he swallowed whatever emotion threatened to surface. "You don't have to decide now," he said finally. "I'll stay as long as you let me." There was no demand in his voice, no expectation, just quiet resolve. For a while, they sat there in silence, listening to the soft laughter of their daughters echoing through the evening air. It was a small, fragile peace, but for both of them, it felt like breathing again after years of suffocation. In the weeks that followed, their lives intertwined even more. James began helping at the art center where Lana taught, donating supplies and occasionally joining her classes. The children adored him, and so did many of the parents who saw how naturally he fit into the small community. Lana watched him with a mix of pride and disbelief, still unsure how to reconcile the man in front of her with the one who had once abandoned her so cruelly. One day, she found him sitting in the yard, helping the girls build a birdhouse. They were covered in paint, laughing as they worked, and she stood by the window watching them, her heart aching with emotions she didn't want to name. That night, after tucking the girls into bed, she found him cleaning up the mess they had made. He looked up as she entered, smiling faintly. "You should go home," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're exhausted." He set down the brush and wiped his hands. "This feels like home," he said quietly. The words hit her harder than she expected. She didn't reply, but as he walked past her to leave, she reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said. He turned to her, confused. "For what?" She hesitated, then met his eyes. "For not walking away this time." That night, long after he had gone, Lana sat alone in the living room, the house silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. She stared at the framed drawing the girls had made that week, for stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. She traced her fingers over it, tears welling in her eyes. Somewhere inside her, a truth was beginning to take shape, fragile but undeniable. The man she had once sworn never to forgive was slowly becoming part of her world again, not through apologies or promises, but through constancy. And though her heart still bore scars, she could feel it, he was mending what he had broken, piece by piece, day by day. The morning sun rose over the coastline, flooding the small town with a soft golden light that made the sea shimmer like glass. James stood outside Lana's house, holding a small paper bag with pastries from the bakery the girls loved. He could hear laughter through the open window and paused before knocking, letting himself listen for a moment. That laughter had become the sound he lived for, the quiet proof that he hadn't completely lost his chance. When Lana opened the door, she looked tired but radiant in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or clothes. There was a calmness in her now, a steadiness that came from surviving too much and still standing. She stepped aside wordlessly, allowing him in. The girls ran to him instantly, hugging his legs and chattering about their plans for the day. It was an ordinary morning, but to James it felt sacred, every routine moment a small miracle he didn't deserve but had been given anyway. They spent the morning at the park, the girls running ahead while James and Lana followed slowly along the path. The air was cool, the scent of salt and flowers mingling in the breeze. For a while they spoke about simple things, the weather, the girls' latest drawings, the repairs still needed around the house, but underneath the casual conversation lay something deeper, something unspoken. Both knew that whatever fragile peace existed between them couldn't last in limbo forever. There would have to come a moment when the truth broke through the surface. James had been carrying that truth for weeks now, the words pressing against his chest, threatening to escape. He wanted to tell her who he truly was to those girls, to claim them as his daughters, but each time he tried, fear stopped him. He didn't fear her anger, he feared losing the delicate trust that had begun to grow between them. That afternoon, as the girls napped, Lana sat at the kitchen table sketching while James fixed the loose handle on one of the cabinets. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the soft sounds of pencil against paper and the occasional creak of wood. Without looking up, she said, "You've changed, James." He froze for a second, unsure how to respond. She lifted her eyes and met his. "The man I knew would never have stayed this long. He wouldn't have tried." He set down the screwdriver, his throat tightening. "Maybe I finally learned what matters," he said quietly. She gave a faint smile, though sadness lingered behind it. "And what's that?" she asked. He hesitated before answering, his voice almost a whisper. "You. Them. This." The simplicity of it seemed to hang in the air between them, fragile but true. She looked down again, pretending to focus on her sketch, but her hand trembled slightly. Days turned into weeks, and their connection deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. There were small moments, shared glances, brief touches, laughter over dinner, that hinted at something rebuilding itself between them. One evening, the girls decided to host what they called a family dinner, insisting that James stay. Lana tried to protest, but their excitement was impossible to resist. They made paper crowns and set the table with mismatched plates, proud of their creation. As they sat down, James found himself surrounded by the life he had never thought he'd have, a warm home, laughter echoing through the air, and Lana sitting across from him, smiling despite herself. The girls took turns announcing what they were thankful for, their small voices pure and sincere. When it was James's turn, he paused for a long moment before saying, "I'm thankful for being allowed to be here." Lana didn't look at him right away, but when she did, there were tears in her eyes she didn't bother to hide. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, they stood together in the kitchen cleaning up. The silence between them was different now, charged with something neither wanted to name. Lana turned to him suddenly, her expression uncertain. "What are you really doing here, James?" she asked. He stared at her, caught off guard by the question. "You say it's about helping, about making things right, but what do you actually want?" He wanted to tell her everything, that the girls were his, that he'd known from the moment he saw them, that every sleepless night had been spent imagining the years he'd missed, but the words caught in his throat. "I just want to be part of your lives," he said finally. "For as long as you'll let me." She studied him for a moment, searching his face for deceit, then turned away, her voice soft. "You can't undo the past. You can't fix it with presence alone." He nodded. "I know. But I can try to build something better, even if it takes the rest of my life." In the days that followed, Lana found herself replaying that conversation in her mind. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that people could change, yet the fear of being hurt again still clung to her. Then one morning, while sorting through old paperwork, she came across a document she hadn't looked at in years, the birth certificates of her daughters. Their father's name was left blank, an empty space that had always haunted her. She stared at it for a long time, her chest tightening. The girls had begun asking questions lately, curious about why their friends at school talked about dads while they didn't. Lana had always managed to change the subject, but she knew she couldn't keep doing that forever. They deserved the truth, but the truth now was complicated. If she told them who James was, she'd have to trust that he was ready to stay, not just for her, but for them. That evening, when he arrived, she handed him the papers without a word. He looked at them, his breath catching when he saw the blank spaces. "You were supposed to be there," she said quietly. "Your name should have been the first thing written." He looked up, pain flickering across his face. "I know," he said. "I can't change that, but I'll spend the rest of my life earning the right to be there." For the first time since that night years ago, she didn't see arrogance or defensiveness in his eyes, only remorse and love so deep it frightened her. She sat down, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to forgive you," she admitted. "Every time I try, the memory of what you said comes back." He sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly. "Then don't forgive me yet," he said. "Just let me keep showing you that I mean it." The following weekend, Lana fell ill for the first time in months. The stress of work and the endless responsibilities had finally caught up with her. James stepped in without hesitation, taking care of the girls, cooking, cleaning, and making sure the house ran smoothly. He barely slept, moving through the days with quiet determination. One night, she woke to find him asleep on the floor beside the bed, still dressed, exhaustion written across his face. For a long time, she simply watched him, realizing that this man, the one who had once shattered her heart, was now the reason she felt safe. The realization terrified her, yet it also brought a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. When she recovered, she found him outside with the girls, teaching them how to fly kites. The wind caught their laughter, carrying it across the open field, and something inside her finally broke free. She walked toward them, her heart pounding, and when he turned to her, their eyes met. The distance between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by something raw and real. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, she found him sitting on the porch, watching the stars. She sat beside him, her voice quiet. "You're good with them," she said. He smiled faintly. "They make it easy." She hesitated, then added, "They deserve to know." He turned to her, unsure of her meaning, and she met his gaze with steady resolve. "They deserve to know who you are, James. All of it." For a moment, neither spoke. The waves crashed softly in the distance, the night air cool against their skin. Then he reached out, his voice trembling. "Are you sure?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "They've waited long enough." He exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since the day he had walked away, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't destined to end in regret. The morning they told the girls was one of those rare, still days when the sea was calm and the air felt heavy with meaning. Lana had barely slept, her thoughts chasing themselves in endless circles through the night. James, too,